and beyond. For me, it is the last beautiful flower in the perfect bouquet, because the 20 years that I had as a professional athlete playing for those 4 wonderful teams, and that 20-year period in California would ever end up in Cooperstown, New York. You say, how in the world can it happen? And it can happen very easily when you have the kinds of friends, the kinds of people, the kinds of support, the kinds of education, and most importantly, the kinds of family that I've had.
I mean, it's a continual learning process, and part of that learning process is teaching yourself that you do belong. And each step, it's like in any profession, each step gives you a bit more confidence, etc. And finally, you get to the point where you say, and it really, I think, the solidification of that for me was the All-Star game in '67.
The truth revealed is this: the story of Tom Seaver did not end with a trophy or a standing ovation or a plaque in Cooperstown. It ended quietly in a house in California with a man who could no longer remember the games that defined a generation. This is what really happened to Tom Terrific, and the full picture is more painful than most fans were ever told. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. He was the greatest pitcher the New York Mets ever produced. He turned a joke of a franchise into world champions. He won 3 Cy Young Awards, reached 311 career victories, and walked into the Hall of Fame with the highest vote percentage in history at that time. The man was a legend in every sense of the word. But 2 separate forces worked against him across the decades, one built by the decisions of powerful men who should have known better and chose not to, and one built by biology itself, slow and invisible, completely indifferent to reputation. By the time the world learned what was truly happening to him, the window to change anything had already closed. For years, the public version of Tom Seaver's story was clean and heroic: the Miracle Mets, 3 Cy Young Awards, the Hall of Fame, a vineyard in California where he lived a quiet and dignified life after baseball. That was the story most people carried with them. The real story is something different. It is the story of a franchise that exiled the most important player it ever had because of arrogance and a personal attack in a newspaper column. It is the story of a disease contracted while gardening in Connecticut that went unrecognized long enough to do permanent and irreversible damage, one of the sharpest minds the game of baseball ever produced. And it is the story of a group of old teammates who flew across the country to say goodbye to a man who could no longer hold a conversation for more than a few minutes without losing the thread completely. If this story hits you the way it should, tap the hype feature on this video and give it some hype so more fans can hear the real truth about Tom Seaver. In March of 2019, the National Baseball Hall of Fame released a quiet statement on behalf of the Seaver family. Tom had been diagnosed with dementia. He was retiring completely from public life. He would not be making appearances. He would not be giving interviews. He would not even be able to attend the 50th anniversary reunion of the 1969 Miracle Mets, the team he had carried to one of the most improbable championships in the history of professional sport. The man at the center of it all, the player who had made that season possible and that franchise meaningful, would not be in the room when his teammates gathered to mark what they had built together. That announcement hit the baseball world hard. But what most people did not know, and what the family had kept private for years by that point, was how long the decline had actually been happening. The 2019 diagnosis was not the beginning of the story. It was close to the end of it. Tom Seaver died on August 31, 2020. He was 75 years old. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at his home in Calistoga, California, from complications of Lewy body dementia and a COVID-19 infection he had contracted during the early months of the global pandemic. He was survived by his wife Nancy and their 2 daughters, Sarah and Anne. The grief was immediate and enormous. Keith Hernandez, his former teammate, released a statement that captured the feeling of an entire sport. He wrote that he was deeply saddened by the passing of Tom Seaver, that he had had the honor of unsuccessfully hitting against him and having him as a teammate, and that Seaver was the greatest Met of all time, and that no one who ever wore the orange and blue would surpass him. He ended his statement with a single word: tears. Gary Cohen, who had worked alongside Seaver as a broadcaster for years, offered something a little different. He said that while the news brought deep sadness, there was also a kind of light in it because the suffering had been prolonged and the decline had been agonizing to watch from a distance. He said Tom had represented their childhood, had been a light that everyone could look to. Even in the moment of loss, Cohen was reaching for the warmth that Seaver had always represented to the people who had watched him pitch and work and live. Lewy body dementia is a progressive disorder. It is the second most common form of progressive dementia after Alzheimer's disease, yet it remains widely misunderstood and frequently misdiagnosed. What happens inside the brain is this: abnormal deposits of a protein called alpha-synuclein build up within neurons. These deposits are known as Lewy bodies, and as they accumulate, They begin to disrupt the chemical messengers the brain depends on to function. The damage spreads across multiple systems simultaneously. Cognition and memory begin to fracture, with severe fluctuations in alertness and the gradual loss of short-term retention. Motor control breaks down, producing symptoms that resemble Parkinson's disease, including rigid muscles, slow-moving tremors. Behavior and sleep are also targeted, with vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and rapid cognitive fatigue becoming part of daily existence. For Tom Seaver, a man who had built his entire identity around absolute bodily control and a razor-sharp analytical mind, progression of Lewy body dementia form of deterioration. The disease targeted precisely the qualities that had made him exceptional. But to understand how he arrived at that ending, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to full scale of what was built before it was slowly and systematically taken apart. The New York Mets secured Tom Seaver's signing rights through a special draft lottery in 1966. The team had finished in last place nearly every season since its founding in 1962. They were a punchline in professional baseball, beloved by their fans for a particular kind of chaotic, losing charm, but not taken seriously by anyone who followed the sport with a competitive eye. Seaver changed that almost immediately upon arrival. He came with a discipline forged during his service in the United States Marine Corps, clinical and analytical approach to preparation that treated pitching as a technical problem to be solved rather than an athletic feat to be admired from the outside. His delivery was built around his legs and his core, a drop-and-drive style that generated power from the ground up and made him devastatingly hard to square up at the plate. In 1967, he won the National League Rookie of the Year award. He was not yet 23 years old and already the most serious person in the organization. He studied hitters the way engineers study load-bearing structure. He tracked his own mechanics with an obsession that went far beyond ordinary preparation. He believed in hard work and repeatable process and disciplined study in a way that made him unusual even among athletes at the highest level. He did not rely on feel or instinct the way many pitchers do. He relied on preparation so thorough that feel was no longer the main variable. By 1969, he had transformed the Mets into something nobody in baseball could have predicted or scripted in advance. Under manager Gil Hodges, a man who demanded accountability and brought a structure to the clubhouse that matched Seaver's own disposition, that team caught fire in the second half of the season and simply did not stop until they were the best team in the world. Seaver finished with a record of 25-7 and an ERA of 2.21. He won his first Cy Young Award. He was 24 years old and already the face of the franchise, already the axis around which everything else on the team turned and organized itself. The pitching depth behind him, the moments of clutch offense, the improbable defensive plays, all of it was made possible, the standard he set at the top of the rotation every fifth day. The Miracle Mets were built on belief and pitching depth and a few moments of genuine magic, but the foundation under all of it was Tom Seaver. Remove him from that equation, and the whole story of 1969 becomes something entirely different. His dominance continued into the following decade without interruption or meaningful decline. On April 22, 1970, he took the mound against the San Diego Padres and struck out 19 batters, tying a major league record that had stood for decades. He did not give up a hit until the fifth inning. The last 10 hitters of the game went down consecutively on strikes, each one dismissed in sequence with the methodical control of a man who was simply executing a plan. The stadium was on its feet for every pitch of that final stretch, and the roar when the last out was recorded was the sound of an entire building, understanding that it had witnessed something irrepeatable. 10 strikeouts in a row to end the game. The record still stands in his name. He won his second Cy Young Award in 1973, going 21-12 with a 2.08 ERA and leading the Mets back to the World Series. He won his third in 1975 after recovering from a year hampered by sciatica, posting 22 wins with 2.38 ERA, 3 Cy Young Awards, 311 career wins, a Hall of Fame vote share of 98.8%, the highest percentage achieved by any player up to that point in the history of the ballot. These were not statistics accumulated by a player who had survived long enough to build a resume through longevity. They were the output of a pitcher who had been, for a sustained and consistent stretch of time, the best in the world at what he did. And that stature, that deep and earned understanding of his own values is exactly put him on a collision course with the men running the New York Mets organization. The collision did not happen in a single dramatic confrontation. It was built slowly through years of contract negotiations that revealed in precise and uncomfortable detail what the front office truly thought about the players who made their franchise worth anything at all. The man at the center of that power structure was M. Donald Grant, the board chairman. Grant was old school baseball management in its most uncompromising and flattering form. He operated under the conviction that athletes should remain subservient to the organization, that the club's interests outweighed any individual's claim to fair compensation, and that a player who argued for his own value was not making a reasonable business case, but displaying a character defect that needed to be checked. Seaver would later describe Grant's approach toward his players as a plantation mentality. That is a blunt and pointed phrase. Based on the documented record of their years together, it is an accurate one. The pattern runs back to 1972. After winning 18 games the previous season, Seaver requested a salary of $125,000. The negotiations were miserable enough that Seaver publicly described them as the most depressing experience of his career. He settled for $120,000. The following year, after 21-12, he asked for a $30,000 raise. The Mets offered $10,000. They settled eventually on $140,000. In 1974, after another Cy Young Award season and a trip to the World Series, the general manager stated on the record that a line had to be drawn somewhere on what a pitcher was worth. They settled on $170,000. Then came 1975, and the decision that probably completed the poisoning of any goodwill that had survived the years of difficult bargaining. Seaver had struggled the prior year with sciatica, winning only 11 games. Grant invoked the maximum allowable 20% pay cut, dropping Seaver's salary to $136,000 for the 1975 season. He had the contractual right to do it. He chose to exercise that right against a man who delivered 3 Cy Young Awards and a World Series championship for the organization without hesitation or sentiment. Seaver came back the following year and won 22 games and his 3rd Cy Young Award. Grant reinstated the salary, but the damage to the relationship was permanent. Grant had shown exactly what the organization's regard for Tom Seaver was worth the moment that permitted him to show it. By 1976, free agency had arrived, and the entire economic structure of professional baseball was being rebuilt. Catfish Hunter had signed a $3.75 million contract with the Yankees. The reserve clause that had bound players to their team indefinitely had been legally overturned. For the first time in the sport's history, players were allowed to understand their actual market value. Seaver, an articulate leader and an active representative for the Major League Baseball Players Association, understood exactly what the market was now saying about a pitcher of his caliber. He demanded a 3-year extension worth $800,000 total. For a 3-time Cy Young winner still performing at an elite level, this was not an excessive ask in the new landscape. Grant refused anyway and dug in, the conviction of a man defending a principle he had held his entire career rather than adapting to a reality that had changed around him. He viewed the demand not as a reasonable contract negotiation, but as an affront to organizational authority. The tension stretched through the winter and into the spring of 1977, with trade rumors circulating openly around Seaver's name. He made clear he would only accept a trade to 4 specific: the Dodgers, the Reds, the Phillies, or the Pirates. He wanted to stay in New York. The list was his protection if the organization left him no choice. In a final genuine attempt to make things work, Seaver bypassed Grant entirely and went directly to the team's owner, Lorinda DeRoulet. She was sympathetic to the man who had made her franchise worth owning. She agreed to a 3-year extension worth $1.1 million total, paying $300,000 in the first year and $400,000 in each of the following 2 years. Trade discussions were stopped. The deal was made. Seaver was going to stay. Then the morning of June 15, 1977 arrived, and with it a column in the New York Daily News written by Dick Young. Young had long operated as a voice that closely reflected front office perspectives, and his column that morning did not engage with the contract or the logic of the market. He did not argue about whether $800,000 over 3 years was for a 3-time Cy Young winner. He did not address whether the agreement DeRoulet had made was fair or unfair to the organization. Instead, it's asserted that Seaver's demands were driven by jealousy of Nolan Ryan, who had signed with the California Angels and was now earning more. Young suggested that the real issue was not market value or labor rights or years of difficult negotiations with a front office that had resented Seaver's self-awareness from the beginning. He claimed it was petty professional envy of a former teammate, and then Young wrote the specific line that shattered the agreement: that Ryan was getting more than Seaver. This galled Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan were very friendly, and that Seaver had long treated Ryan like a brother. He put Nancy Seaver's name in a newspaper column about a labor dispute. He used her personal friendship with another player's wife as a weapon against her husband, turning a professional contract negotiation into something intimate and ugly and impossible to move past. This was not an accident or a careless mention. It was a deliberate choice to use the most personal element available: the relationship between 2 women who had been close friends during their husbands' shared years on the Mets roster as the instrument of maximum damage. Whatever purpose it was meant to serve, the effect was immediate and irreversible. Seaver read the column that morning and called the Mets front office. Whatever patience he had extended across years of pay cuts and demeaning negotiations and a management culture that had never once treated him as a partner rather than a commodity, it was finished. He said clearly and without room for interpretation, "That is it. It is all over. Make the deal." On the night of June 15, 1977, The Mets finalized the trade that sent Tom Seaver to the Cincinnati Reds. On the exact same night, they also traded Dave Kingman, a legitimate power hitter who had clubbed 37 home runs the previous season, to the San Diego Padres, and Mike Phillips to the St. Louis Cardinals. 3 significant pieces gone in a single evening in a set of transactions that Mets fans have called the Midnight Massacre ever since. The name is right in every sense of the word. It happened at night. It felt like an assassination. The franchise that had been built into something real over the prior decade had been gutted in the time it takes a city to go to sleep. It felt less like a series of calculated business decisions and more like an organization dismantling its own foundation in a single act of management failure and institutional dysfunction. For Seaver, the Mets received Pat Zachary, a starting pitcher at 3-7 with a 5.04 ERA at the time of the trade. Doug Flynn, utility infielder who won 91 in New York. Steve Henderson, a promising minor league outfielder, finished second in NL Rookie of the Year voting and showed genuine talent. And Dan Norman, a minor league outfielder who spent most of his Mets tenure underperforming or in the minors and never became a meaningful contributor at the major league level. That was the exchange. The full accounting for the greatest player in franchise history. Seaver pitched his Reds debut 3 days later and threw a 3-hit shutout. He did not need a grace period. He did not carry the emotional weight of the circumstances onto the mound in any visible way. He went out and did what he had always done because the only thing he knew how to do with difficult work. He finished the remainder of that 1977 season at 14-3 with a 2.34 ERA. He had been traded mid-season, relocated to a new city, separated from the organization that had been his professional home for more than a decade, and he immediately became one of the best pitchers in the National League. Baseball writers compared the transaction to the hypothetical of the New York Yankees trading Mickey Mantle to the Boston Red Sox in his prime. That comparison was not hyperbole. It was a genuine attempt to find the closest equivalent in the sport's history because nothing else quite captured the scale of what the Mets had done to themselves. M. Donald Grant, defending himself to the media in the weeks that followed, declared with full confidence that 20 years from now people would remember it as the Dan Norman trade. Dan Norman never established himself as a meaningful major league player. The Mets lost tens of thousands of fans over the following seasons. Their attendance collapsed and did not recover for years. Their competitive standing fell apart entirely. Grant resigned in 1978, pushed out by the accumulated pressure of what his management era had produced. The franchise spent the better part of a decade in the wilderness he had helped create. Seaver kept pitching. He went on to win his 300th game, finished with 311 victories, elected to the Hall of Fame with a vote share that no player in the history of the ballot had ever achieved before him. Returned briefly to New York in 1983 when the Mets reacquired him, giving the fans who had been waiting 6 years a chance to see him in their colors again. He survived the exile. He proved on the field every single year exactly what the Mets had given away. But the next enemy was already present inside him, building quietly in the years after 1991, and it had nothing to do with management or newspaper columns or any decision any human being had made. After baseball, Seaver worked as a broadcaster and a scout. Like many elite competitors after their career's end, he searched for something that could give his days the same focus and purpose and physical demand that pitching had always required. In 1997, he and Nancy purchased 116 acres on Diamond Mountain in Calistoga, California, in the northern end of Napa Valley. The land was undeveloped and forested and needed to be shaped into something. That was exactly the kind of project he was looking for. Around 2000, they planted approximately 3.5 acres of vineyard dedicated almost entirely to Cabernet Sauvignon. Vineyard manager Jim Barbour and winemaker Thomas Rivers Brown joined the operation. Production was kept deliberately small, between 400 and 600 cases per year, built around a single premium bottling called the GTS Cabernet Sauvignon. He worked the rows himself every day, clippers in his pocket, his Labrador retrievers moving through the vines alongside him. He pruned and cleared brush and sorted fruit beside his team. He had grown up in Fresno, California, where his father had worked in the raisin industry. Agriculture was not new to him. The connection to the land was personal and genuine, not the casual hobby of a famous person for a story to tell. The vineyard was a sanctuary. It was a place where he could channel the same obsessive focus that had once gone into studying hitters and perfecting mechanics into something physical and slow and deeply grounding. The work of a vineyard does not accommodate shortcuts or approximations. The vines have to be pruned at the right time, in the right way, for reasons that accumulate over seasons and years. The soil has to be understood. The weather has to be read. It demands the kind of sustained systematic attention that had always been Seaver's natural mode. He was not a man who could sit still and feel you. The vineyard did not ask him to sit still. For those who knew what was happening inside his body, it also served as something else. A daily act of staying present, staying physical, staying connected to the world, the concrete work of his hands. Because the neurological deterioration that would eventually take his life had already begun its slow and its silent approach. The health story begins in 1991. While working in his garden in Greenwich, Connecticut, Seaver was bitten by a tick carrying the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. He contracted the infection, he was treated with standard antibiotics, and appeared to recover. For most people, early and effective treatment resolves Lyme disease without long-term consequences. But the bacteria responsible, Borrelia burgdorferi, has the capacity to persist in the body and remain dormant for extended periods, particularly in the central nervous system, when initial treatment does not fully eliminate it. It can wait. For years, it can simply wait. For Seaver, the reactivation came in 2012, more than 2 decades after the original infection had seemingly been resolved. The relapse was severe and deeply disorienting. He described the experience as a perpetual case of the flu, a relentless, grinding physical misery that would not lift. He suffered profound fatigue, sleep disturbances, severe nausea, and Bell's palsy, which is a condition where one side of the face becomes temporarily weak or partially paralyzed due to inflammation of the facial nerve. But the symptom that alarmed him most was cognitive. He began experiencing significant short-term memory lapses and fusion that were frightening enough to make him fear at various points that he had suffered a stroke. For a man whose identity had been built on precision and mental acuity, these episodes were a bit of horror. Early in 2013, the diagnosis arrived: stage 3 neurological Lyme disease. The infection had crossed into his central nervous system and had been advancing inside his brain for months before it was properly identified. The delay was not a small thing. Doctors told Seaver directly that the neurological damage was irreversible. His memory loss would gradually worsen over time. There was no treatment that could undo what the unrecognized infection had already accomplished. The medical connection between what the Lyme disease did to his brain and the Lewy body dementia that eventually killed him is important to understand, even in plain terms. When the bacteria responsible for neurological Lyme disease crosses the blood-brain barrier, it triggers a sustained inflammatory response. Immune cells called microglia, which normally protect the brain, become overactivated and begin damaging the neural networks they are supposed to defend. Blood vessels inside the brain become inflamed in a process called cerebral vasculitis. The signals between neurons begin to break down, and this state of chronic internal inflammation can accelerate the kind of protein misfolding that causes neurodegenerative disease. For Seaver specifically, the sustained inflammation from years of unrecognized neurological infection is described as having acted as a major catalyst accelerating the progression of the Lewy body dementia that would eventually claim his life. 2 diseases, separated by decades, working in sequence toward one conclusion. He kept showing up in his vineyard through all of it. Even after the 2013 diagnosis, even after doctors had told him directly that the damage to his brain was permanent and the trajectory was only going to in one direction, Seaver continued to walk his rows every morning, his clippers in his pocket, his dogs alongside him through the vines. The same quiet refusal to give ground discipline that had defined the mound at Shea Stadium was now applied to the hillside above Calistoga against an opponent that could not be prepared for or studied or outworked by any amount of effort. He did not quit, not beat the disease by showing up in the vineyard every day. But he showed up anyway because that was the only way he had ever known how to live. By 2017, those closest to him could see the change clearly in a way that could no longer be explained by a bad day or a difficult morning or the ordinary variability of a man getting older. The decline was visible and consistent and moving in one direction. Art Shamsky, who had stayed close to Seaver in the years since their playing days together, understood that the window was closing. He organized a trip. He gathered Jerry Koosman, Ron Swoboda, and Bud Harrelson, and the 4 of them flew across the country. They came to Diamond Mountain. They came to see Tom Seaver one more time in the only way that still meant something before the window shut permanently and the chance was gone. Harrelson had prepared the group before they arrived. He and Seaver had been close friends and roommates during their playing years together, Seaver calling him Roomy for the rest of their shared lives. Harrelson was himself beginning to struggle with the early stages of Alzheimer's disease by that point, and he understood from close personal experience what cognitive decline looked like and what it asked of everyone around it. He told Shamsky plainly, Seaver would forget things from before. The mind they had all depended on and respected and loved for decades was no longer reliable in the ways it once had been. When they arrived at the vineyard, physical presence of Tom Seaver was still largely intact. He was still recognizable, still himself in his body, still carrying himself with a bearing of the man they had known. But his mind was visibly slipping away from him in real time, right there on the patio where they sat together. He forgot conversations that had happened minutes earlier. He cycled through the same stories without any awareness that he had already told them, arriving at the same points again and again as if each time was the first. The group sat with him and did not correct him. They did not let the discomfort show, because the kindest thing available to them was to simply be present and let him enjoy the afternoon exactly as he was experiencing it. They drank wine from his own bottles, wine grown on the land he had worked with his own hands for 20 years. They talked about 1969 They talked about the season nobody expected them to win, about September of that year when the whole country started paying attention to a team that had been a punchline for its entire existence. They talked about the games that had seemed impossible until they were not the championship that had started as a joke and ended as the thing that defined all of them forever. They talked about what it had felt like to be young and talented, part of something that nobody had believed in except themselves. They laughed together on that hilltop in Calistoga above the vines that Seaver had planted and tended through years of morning work, and they did it all with the shared unspoken knowledge that this was the last time. That this afternoon, with this wine and these old stories and this man who could not hold the thread of a conversation for more than a few minutes, but whose laughter was still exactly right, was the ending. The final scene of something that had started more than 50 years before on a baseball field in New York, the pitcher who had arrived ready to change everything. Art Shamsky later wrote about the visit, his memoir, After the Miracle. He described the gathering as the lengthiest of goodbyes. Those 4 words are exactly right, and the weight they carry does not diminish with distance or time. The goodbye had not started that afternoon on the hilltop in Calistoga. It had been going on for years already, building through 2012 Lyme relapse and the stage 3 neurological diagnosis in 2013, and quiet, gradual withdrawals from public life as Seaver's capabilities narrowed year by year in ways that were visible to people who had known him. The goodbye had been in progress for at least 5 years before that visit, and it continued for 3 more years after Shamsky and Koosman and Swoboda and Harrelson flew home, patient and relentless and unable to be negotiated with or outworked or refused until the morning of August 31, 2020, when it was finally and completely finished and the longest goodbye in the history of the Miracle Mets was over. The truth revealed in this entire story is not contained in one single moment of betrayal or one diagnostic failure or one wrong decision by one powerful man. It is 2 distinct tragedies woven through the same life, separated by decades but connected by a single underlying thread. That the forces surrounding Tom Seaver, whether institutional or biological, were never adequate to the man himself, and the gap between what he deserved and what he received was never made right. The first tragedy was constructed entirely by human choices, made by people who had the power and the opportunity to choose differently at every step and consistently did not. Donald Grant spent years treating the most valuable player on his roster as a subordinate who needed to be controlled rather than a professional who deserved partnership and respect. He enforced maximum pay cuts when the rules allowed it, without sentiment or acknowledgement of what the player had already given the organization. He resisted every contract request with termination of someone who believed that management authority over athletes was a natural and permanent right rather than a negotiated arrangement that players were now learning to challenge and draw from. He built an organizational culture in which a newspaper columnist felt comfortable putting a player's wife's name in print in order to destroy a contract agreement and drive the player to demand a trade. Whether that column was directly coordinated from within the front office, or whether it grew organically from an environment in which management's interests and the columnist's perspective had aligned for so many years that no explicit coordination was necessary, the culture that produced it belongs to Grant. Seaver left. Grant's famous prediction about Dan Norman became a permanent record of how completely and catastrophically management had miscalculated the value of what it had given away. He was gone from the organization a year. The franchise he had helped damage spent the better part of a decade in the consequences of that damage. The fans who had watched Seaver build the Mets into something real carried the loss much longer than Grant was ever required to. The second tragedy was built by biology and by a diagnostic failure that arrived too late to matter. The Lyme disease contracted in a Connecticut garden in 1991 was not anyone's negligence or miscalculation. It's the kind of misfortune that happens to people who spend time outdoors in certain parts of the country. The failure to identify the neurological progression of that infection during its months of active and unrecognized advancement in 2012 and into 2003 was the kind of failure that leaves a permanent mark. By the time the stage 3 neurological diagnosis came, doctors could describe exactly what had been lost inside Seaver's brain. They could not describe any path to getting it back because no such path existed. The delay had cost him the only window in which early intervention might have changed his trajectory. And the chronic brain inflammation from years of unrecognized infection established the conditions that accelerated the Lewy body dementia through its stages. 2 diseases in sequence across 30 years toward one ending. Gary Cohen said there was a light in the sadness when Tom Seaver passed. He said Seaver had been a light that everyone would look to, had represented their childhood, had been something fixed and reliable in the way that great athletes sometimes become the people who grow up watching them. That framing survives everything in this story. It outlasts M. Donald Grant and Dick Young and the Midnight Massacre and the contract disputes and the plantation mentality and the years of insulting negotiations that strip the goodwill out of a relationship between a franchise and the player who built it. It outlasts the Lyme disease contracted while working in a garden and the delayed diagnosis that arrived months too late to prevent irreversible damage and the chronic brain inflammation that accelerated the progression of a neurodegenerative disease through its stages across years of quiet decline. It outlasts all of it. The light was in the 311 wins and the 3 Cy Young Awards and the 19 strikeouts and the Hall of Fame plaque and the rows he walked every morning with his dogs and the wine he poured for his teammates on the last afternoon they ever spent together. The light was in Keith Hernandez writing a single word when no other word was adequate to the moment: tears. Tom Seaver deserved better from the franchise that owed everything to him and let him go over a newspaper column and a management culture that fused dominance with leadership. He deserved a front office that understood what it had, one that valued the man as much as the wins he produced, one that would have protected the agreement Deroulé made instead of allowing it to be collapsed by a columnist the next morning. He deserved the kind of institutional loyalty that matches the individual loyalty he'd shown across a decade of difficult negotiations in which he never stopped performing at the highest level, even while arguing for fair pay. He deserved better from the medical timeline that could not identify what was happening inside his brain, while there was still a chance to protect him from the worst of it. He deserved better from both of the forces that failed him, and he never received what he deserved from either one. Most people who ever watched him pitch understood the first part of that, even without the full picture. Now you have both. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below about what you already knew going in and what changed for you by the end of it. Tell us your memory of Tom Seaver, the game you watched, the moment that stayed with you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and give this video a like so more people can find the real story of the man who made the Mets matter and deserved far better than the forces that worked against him across his lifetime ever gave him.